Careful, ma'am. That's a real jet, not a flight sim ride. You sure you don't want the gift shop tour instead?" The laughter came right on cue. 3 young pilots, leaning against the hangar door, sun at their backs. The man who'd spoken stood in the open, hands on his hips, chin up, playing to them. Captain Brett Maddox, flight commander. Golden boy. The kind of man who narrated his own life because he assumed everyone wanted the broadcast. The woman he was talking to did not look up. Her gloved hand was already inside the intake of the F-16, fingers spread, sweeping the duct for foreign object debris the way a surgeon checks for a sponge. She found nothing loose. She withdrew her hand, wiped 2 fingers along the lip of the inlet, checked them, and moved on. She had not acknowledged him. She had not acknowledged any of them. 7:10 in the morning. The desert was already shimmering. Heat came up off the ramp in slow waves, bending the far end of the flight line into water that wasn't there. The jet in front of her wore a fresh coat of gray and a maintenance tag clipped to the canopy rail, marked for a functional check flight. Somebody had signed it ready. She did not believe them yet. She wore a plain flight suit. No wings, no name tape, no squadron patch. A contractor's flight safety lanyard hung at her chest, the laminated card turned backward. To everyone on that ramp, she was a visitor, a clipboard, a box on someone's calendar. She had flown 4 aircraft she was not supposed to survive. None of them had a gift shop. "I'll pass on the tour," she said. That was all. She didn't sharpen it. She didn't soften it. She set it down between them like a tool she might need later and went back to the airframe. A clipboard, they'd decided. The word had arrived before she had, passed down from the operations office, where her visit had been logged as a civilian flight safety evaluation, a box to check, a nuisance with a lanyard. Nobody had read past the first line of the tasking. Nobody ever did. That was the whole reason it worked. Her voice was flat and unhurried, pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and no farther. She crouched at the main landing gear, ran a thumbnail along the strut, checked the torque marks on the wheel nuts, and stood. She moved down the airframe the way water moves downhill. No wasted motion. Panel fasteners, pitot cover, static ports, the trailing edge flaps, which she pressed with the flat of her hand, and watched settle. At the wing root, she stopped. She tilted her head, reached up under the leading edge, and traced a line that ran along the inboard rib. A hydraulic line. Her glove came away with a faint sheen on the fingertips. As she reached, the cuff of her sleeve slid back, and for half a second, the burn scar showed on the inside of her right wrist. Old, smooth, the color of candle wax. Then the sleeve fell, and the scar was gone. Behind her, Maddox kept talking. "See, this is the thing about safety people," he said to his audience, not to her. "They show up, they touch things, they write a report nobody reads, and they fly home and bill the government for the privilege. You want a coffee, ma'am? We can get you a coffee." A heavy man in a flight line vest had drifted over from the maintenance side. Chief Master Sergeant Luis Ferrante. 30 years on a flight line, most of them on this kind of jet. He was chewing a piece of gum, slow, the way a man chews when he's mostly thinking. He wasn't watching her face. He was watching her hands. She turned to him, not to Maddox. "Your number 2 hydraulic line's chafed," she said. "Where it crosses the rib, just inboard. I wouldn't sign that off." Ferrante stopped chewing. Maddox laughed. "We'll alert the maintenance gods," he said, and a couple of the lieutenants chuckled with him, because that was the deal. He made the joke. They made the sound. But Ferrante didn't laugh. He set down the clipboard he'd been carrying, walked to the wing, and crouched under the leading edge where she'd been. He reached up. He felt along the line. His hand went still. He brought his fingers back into the light and looked at the sheen on them. He looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that has just told you that you were wrong about the day you were going to have. Then he looked up at the woman, who had already moved on to the next panel, her back to him, calm as a closed door. "Where'd you learn to spot that, ma'am?" he asked. She didn't turn around. "Around," she said. The lieutenants were still grinning. Maddox was still talking. The sun was still climbing. And Chief Master Sergeant Luis Ferrante stood under the wing of a jet that had been signed safe to fly, with hydraulic fluid drying on his fingertips, and felt the first cold thread of a feeling he couldn't yet name. He wiped his hand on his trousers and did not wipe the feeling off with it. The woman finished her walk-around, made one small note in a pocket-sized book, and clicked her pen closed. Nobody on that ramp knew her name. That was about to become the most expensive ignorance any of them had ever bought. The ready room smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. Maddox owned it the way he owned the ramp. He had a chair he liked near the front, and he sat in it backward, arms folded over the seat back, holding court while the morning's flights got briefed. He decided to have some fun with the evaluator. All right, he said, raising his hands for quiet. Since we've got a safety professional with us today, let's get the professional opinion. Pop quiz, ma'am. For the room. He grinned. Single engine flameout. You're up high. Motor quits. Give me the air start envelope. Airspeed, altitude, the whole thing. Take your time. It was a setup. Everyone knew it was a setup. The lieutenants leaned in, smiling, waiting for the silence, the stammer, the "I'm not a pilot" deflection that would let them laugh again. Lancaster was standing at the back, near the coffee, holding a paper cup she hadn't drunk from. She set it down. 230 knots, 18,000 feet. Jet fuel starter to the green band, she said. If you're below the windmill restart line, you use the JFS. Throttle to off, then around the horn. Watch your EGT on the relight, or you'll cook the can. You want the backup procedure, or was the first one enough? The room did not laugh. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. One of the lieutenants, a young man named Pratt, looked at Maddox the way you look at a friend who has just walked you into a wall. Maddox recovered fast. He always did. Lucky guess, he said, smiling, and moved on to the schedule. But the temperature in the room had changed by a degree, and everyone could feel it, except perhaps the man at the front who needed not to. After the brief, Lancaster stayed behind. She pulled the maintenance binder for the check flight jet off the table and opened it. Slow, page by page. She wasn't reading it like a visitor. She was reading it like a woman counting cards. She stopped on a page near the back. A functional check flight, signed off as complete. Inspector's initials, supervisor's initials, a date. Clean. Tidy. Final. She turned to the engine run log for the same tail number, same week. There were no flight hours. The jet had been signed as flown, certified airworthy after a major repair, and the engine had never turned for it. On paper, the aircraft had passed a flight that had not happened. She did not gasp. She did not write fraud in red ink. She took out her little book, copied the tail number, the date, and the 2 sets of initials in a small, square hand, and closed the binder exactly where she'd found it. She turned 3 more pages. Another check flight, another tail number, the same clean signatures, the same empty engine log. A pattern doesn't whisper. It repeats until you can't pretend you didn't hear it. She found 4 before she stopped counting, because counting was a thing you did when you were trying to convince yourself, and she was already convinced. She thought about the young pilots in the ready room who'd laughed on cue. She thought about the jets they climbed into every morning, certified sound by men who had never turned the engines. She thought about how a fire starts, not all at once, but quietly, in a clamp, on a line, in a binder, while everyone watches the man making jokes at the front of the room. Ferrante had come back in for a fresh coffee. He saw her at the table. He saw which binder. "Where'd you say you flew, ma'am?" he asked. Quiet. Just the two of them. She slid the binder back into the rack, squared its spine with the others, and looked at him for the first time. Full on. Pale eyes. Nothing in them you could use. "I didn't," she said. She walked out into the heat. Behind her, Ferrante stood with his coffee going cold in his hand. Then he set it down, picked up the same binder, opened it to the same page, and reached into his vest for his phone. He photographed the functional check sign-off. He photographed the empty engine log beside it. His thumb was not quite steady. He had been on flight lines for 30 years. He knew what a clean lie looked like when it was sitting in a binder pretending to be the truth. And he knew that the woman who had just walked out into the sun had seen it in 9 seconds flat, and had let him be the one to find it twice. That was not how visitors behaved. That was how someone behaved when they wanted you to find it yourself, so that later you'd believe your own eyes instead of her word. He didn't know what she was. He was beginning to understand he should find out before Captain Maddox did something that couldn't be unsigned. By the second day, they had a name for her. Clipboard. It moved down the flight line the way nicknames do, hand to hand, grin to grin, until even the fuel troops were using it. Clipboard wants to see the forms. Watch out, clipboard's on the ramp. Somebody taped a paper clipboard to the door of the trailer they'd given her to work in. Maddox thought that one was very funny. Lancaster took the paper clipboard off the door, folded it once, and set it on the desk inside. She didn't throw it away. She seemed to keep things. The pylon had a rhythm to it now, and Maddox conducted it. When she walked toward the ramp at 0840 to watch a launch, he stepped into her path with 2 of his lieutenants flanking him and put his hand up, palm out, smiling for the audience that always seemed to be there. "Clipboard doesn't go past the yellow line," he said. "Liability. Insurance. You understand, sweetheart. Can't have a civilian wandering around live aircraft. Somebody could get hurt." He let that sit, enjoying it. "Probably you." Lancaster stopped at the yellow line. She did not argue. She did not pull the laminated card off her lanyard and turn it around and make him read it. She took out her little book. 0840, she said, writing as she spoke in that flat, even voice. Captain Maddox denied a flight safety evaluator ramp access during launch operations. 2 witnesses. She looked up. "Spell your first name for me. Is it Brett with 2 T's? Something flickered across his face. Not fear. Maddox didn't have the imagination for fear yet. Just the small irritation of a man whose joke isn't landing the way it used to. "Cute," he said, and walked off, and the lieutenants laughed because he needed them to. One of them didn't. First Lieutenant Sarah Vance stood a little apart from the others, arms crossed, looking at the ramp instead of at the show. She was young, maybe 26, with the careful posture of someone who had recently learned that being good wasn't the same as being safe. 2 days earlier, she'd written up a jet, a real gripe, a real problem with the flight controls. And 2 days earlier, she'd been told to fly it anyway. And she had, because the alternative was a conversation about whether she really wanted to be a fighter pilot. She watched the woman they called Clipboard write in her little book, calm as Sunday, and Vance felt something she couldn't name pull at her. The woman wasn't afraid of Maddox. Vance had never once, in 18 months on this base, seen anyone not be afraid of Maddox. Lancaster clicked her pen shut and turned to go. For just a second, her eyes passed over Vance and stopped. Held. Not unkind. Just seeing her. Seeing all of it. The gripe she'd signed off under pressure. The flying she shouldn't have done. The things she carried. Then Lancaster walked away toward her trailer, unhurried, and left Vance standing at the yellow line with her arms crossed and her stomach in a knot. You think the people who laugh loudest are the strong ones. You think the woman writing quietly in a notebook is the one losing. That's the mistake. The oldest one in the book, and it's the mistake this whole base was about to make at the top of its lungs. If stories about people who get badly, beautifully underestimated are the reason you're here, do something for me before this one turns. Subscribe to Honor Tales. Because what happens to the people who mistook her patience for weakness is the entire reason this channel exists. By mid-morning of the third day, the jet was grounded. A red X appeared in the aircraft forms. A hard down, the kind of write-up that says, "This aircraft will not fly until somebody with authority clears it." The gripe described a flight control rigging fault. It was detailed. It was specific. It was signed. And it was attributed to her. The signature block named the flight safety evaluator as the originating authority, as if she had grounded the jet, as if the meddling civilian had finally found the problem she'd been hunting for and shut down a launch to prove she mattered. It was clean work. It made her look like exactly what they'd been calling her, a clipboard who justified her trip by gumming up the works. It also, conveniently, scrubbed the check flight she'd been sent to evaluate. No flight, no evaluation. No evaluation, no questions about the binder. Major Dale Pruitt delivered the news himself. Pruitt was the operations officer, and where Maddox was loud, Pruitt was smooth. He found her in her trailer, knocked once on the open door as a courtesy he didn't mean, and leaned in the frame with the easy authority of a man who had never in his career been told no by anyone who outranked him in the room. "I'm hearing you grounded one of my jets," he said. Pleasant, reasonable, a blade in a velvet sheath. "I didn't ground anything," Lancaster said. She was sitting at the desk with the folded paper clipboard at her elbow and her little book open in front of her. "Forms say you did." He stepped in without being asked. "Look, ma'am, I'm sure you mean well, but contractors observe. They don't touch my jets, and they don't touch my numbers. You've made your point. You found a chafed line. Good. Gold star. But you're starting to cost this squadron flying hours, and flying hours are the only thing I get measured on. So," he smiled, "wrap it up. I'll have you on a plane home by noon." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood and walked past him out the door, and he followed because men like Pruitt cannot stand to be walked away from. She went to the jet, the grounded one. She didn't touch it. She was very careful, in front of the two maintainers standing by, not to touch it. She read the forms clipped to the canopy rail. She read the red X gripe with her name on it. She read the rigging fault description. "This gripe is fabricated," she said. "Flat. Certain." Pruitt's smile thinned. "Careful. The fault it describes would show up on the flight control built-in test. There's no bit code logged. There's no rig check work order. There's no torque stripe disturbance on any of the rigging hardware. Look at it. The paint's undisturbed." She pointed, not touching. "Nobody opened this airplane. Somebody wrote a problem that isn't here, signed my name to it, and grounded a jet to keep it from flying a check it would have passed. Or failed." She turned and looked at him. "Which is it, Major? Would it have passed?" For just a second, half a second, the velvet slipped, and she saw the thing underneath, and the thing underneath was afraid. Then it was gone, and he was smiling again. "You're done here by noon," he said softly, and walked away. Lancaster looked at her watch. It was 11:40. She went back to her trailer, sat down, and opened her little book to a fresh page. She copied the gripe number. She copied the time. She made a small, neat note about undisturbed torque stripes and the absence of a bit code. Then she took out her phone and photographed the forms through the canopy rail from 3 angles. Careful, again, never to touch the jet. Ferrante found her there 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway the way Pruitt had, but he didn't lean, and he didn't smile. "Ma'am," he said quietly, I need to tell you something, and I need you to take it serious." He glanced over his shoulder at the empty ramp behind him, then back. "Pruitt makes paperwork problems disappear. That's his whole thing. Numbers, gripes, hours. Whatever doesn't fit the story he's selling upstairs, it just stops existing." He paused. "And from what I've seen this week, the man makes people disappear too. Transferred, grounded, out. You keep pulling on this, and you're going to find out you were never here. Your report's going to evaporate, and so are you." Lancaster clicked her pen shut. "That's good to know," she said. "Thank you, Chief." "That's it? That's good to know. That's it?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, something almost like warmth crossed her face. Not for him, exactly, but for the fact of him. The fact that a 30-year crew chief had walked across a hot ramp to warn a clipboard he didn't know anything. "You're a good man, Chief Ferrante. I'd remember that the next few days. Whatever happens, you did the right thing, and you did it when it was expensive." He didn't know what to do with that, so he nodded once and left. And Lancaster sat in the heat with a fabricated gripe, photographed 3 ways on her phone, and a noon deadline she had no intention of meeting, and waited for the morning, and the flight she was absolutely going to fly. Ferrante didn't sleep that night. He spent it in the maintenance records vault with the door shut and a desk lamp on, pulling binders. He started with the check flight jet and worked outward. Tail number by tail number, he laid the functional check sign-offs next to the engine run logs and the flight hour records, and the picture assembled itself the way a bad X-ray does. Slowly, and then all at once. Dozens of functional check flights, signed complete, certified airworthy, and no engine hours to match, no flight hours. The jets had come out of major maintenance, gotten a signature that said a pilot had taken them up and wrung them out and found them sound, and then gone straight onto the flight schedule to fly with troops in them, on the strength of a check that had never left the ground. The readiness numbers Pruitt briefed upstairs were beautiful, the cleanest in the wing, because the expensive, time-eating, schedule-wrecking step, actually flying the jets to prove they were safe, had been quietly deleted and replaced with a pen. Ferrante sat back in the metal chair and felt 30 years of his own signatures sitting heavy on his chest. He hadn't signed these, but he'd worked the flight line they fed, and he'd strapped young pilots into airplanes that a piece of paper swore were sound, and the paper had been lying. He pulled one more binder, the oldest in the stack, and laid it open under the lamp, and he thought about Lieutenant Vance. She'd written up a flight control gripe 2 weeks back, a real one, he'd seen it. And then the gripe had quietly changed status overnight, and the jet had flown, and the lieutenant had stopped looking people in the eye. He hadn't connected it to anything then. He connected it now. Pruitt didn't just invent flights that never happened. He erased the problems that did. A young pilot's honest fear, sanded down to a clean number on a slide. That was the part that turned Ferrante's stomach worse than the fraud. The fraud was about money and reputation. This was about feeding kids into the sky on a lie and teaching them to be quiet about it. He photographed every page. He backed it up twice. And he made himself a promise, alone in that vault, that whatever happened to the woman they called Clipboard, the binders were going to outlive Major Pruitt's version of events. He thought about the woman. Clipboard. The way she'd found the chafed line in 9 seconds. The way she'd quoted the AirStart envelope cold. The way she'd read the flight line frequency the day before, when the tower had called traffic, and she'd murmured the readback under her breath. Automatic. Perfect. The cadence of someone who had said those words 10,000 times with her life on the other end of them. He'd heard that cadence exactly once before in his career, a long time ago, from a pilot whose name he wasn't allowed to say out loud. In the morning, He found Maddox at the coffee and pulled him aside, away from the lieutenants, into the equipment room where the door closed. "I need you to stop," Ferrante said. "Whatever you and Pruitt have got going with that woman, stop it. Today." Maddox laughed. "Chief, relax. She's a clipboard. By lunch, she's a story we tell at the bar." "She is not a clipboard." Ferrante stepped closer, and his voice dropped. And there was 30 years in it. "Son, I have been on flight lines since before you could drive. I have heard exactly one person in my life read a tower frequency the way she does, like the words are load-bearing, like she's holding something up with them. One. And you don't want to know what happened to the last man who got in that pilot's way, because I watched it, and it was the worst day of his career, and he deserved it less than you do. He let that land. If she is who I think she is, you need to walk away. Right now. Before you put your hands on something you can't put back." For one moment, Maddox almost heard him. You could see it. A flicker, a crack. The boy under the captain wondering if the chief might possibly know something he didn't. It would have cost him nothing to walk away. A shrug, a joke. The day would have ended quietly, and he'd have flown jets for another 20 years and told no one about the week the safety lady came. But Maddox had an audience in his head even when the room was empty. And men who perform for an audience in their head cannot afford to be seen backing down, not even by themselves. "She's a clipboard," he said again, and smiled, and walked back out to the coffee. Ferrante stood alone in the equipment room and rubbed his face with one hand. Out on the ramp, in the early cool, Lancaster was already at the jet, the grounded one, the Red X quietly lifted overnight by a maintenance officer who'd actually inspected it and found nothing wrong, because there had never been anything wrong. She was doing her walk-around again. Slow, methodical. The same as the first morning. Panel fasteners, P-toe cover. The hydraulic line, repaired now, which she checked twice. She climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, and began to strap in. Coke fittings, lap belt, the flow of switches under her hands moving in an order nobody on that flight line had been taught, because it wasn't a checklist order, it was a combat order, the sequence you build when you've had to do it fast in the dark with something trying to kill you. A maintainer at the tower frequency heard a calm voice, key up to confirm the radios, give a read back, and go quiet again. Perfect cadence. Load-bearing. You've watched a whole base decide this woman is nobody. You've watched them name her, block her, forge her signature, and try to put her on a plane. And you still don't know what she did 16 years ago, in the dark, over a country none of these men have ever flown a combat sortie above. You're about to. But first, if you've ever been the quietest person in a loud room and known something they didn't, you already understand her. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay with me, because the next part is the one that explains the scar on her wrist. She kept the ribbon in a drawer, not on a wall. That night, in the small bare room they'd assigned her in the visiting quarters, Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Lancaster sat on the edge of a thin mattress and opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a worn flight glove, the leather gone soft and dark at the palm, and a single ribbon in a flat case. Pale blue. The kind of blue you only earn one way. She did not take the ribbon out. She just looked at it for a while. She did this sometimes, not often. She found it cheapened the thing to do it often. She thought, the way she always did when she let herself near that drawer, about a night in the late winter of 2016, over a stretch of bad country in the anti-ISIS campaign, when a strike package had gone wrong and a pilot had ended up on the ground, where pilots are not supposed to be. The downed crew had come up on the radio, voice steady, giving their position, and the recovery had launched, and the recovery had flown straight into a wall. The enemy had moved air defense systems into the area. Radar-guided, mobile, patient. The combat search and rescue helicopters, slow and low and full of the people who were supposed to bring everyone home, could not get in. Every time they tried, the radar woke up and the sky filled with the thing that kills helicopters. Lancaster had been on a separate tasking, 2 ships, call sign that didn't matter anymore. Her wingman was Captain Ray Okafor. Talon, they called him. A steady, funny man with a baby daughter and a way of saying everything's fine on the radio that made everything feel fine. She'd taken a hit early. Something off the ground had reached up and put a hole in her jet, and the airplane was flying ugly, one system bleeding into another. The kind of damage where the smart thing, the briefed thing, the thing the regulations were written in blood to make you do, was to turn for home and nurse it back and live. The downed pilot's voice had come up again. Lower now. They can hear me moving. I don't think I have long. And the recovery helos had asked the question nobody wants to ask. Is there any way to suppress that air defense? Because we cannot get in, and we are out of time. Lancaster had looked at her wounded jet and done the math. Then she'd turned the ugly, bleeding airplane around and flown it back into the ring. She'd put herself where the radar wanted to look, low, loud, impossible to ignore. And she had pulled the enemy's attention onto her own aircraft so the helicopters could run the gap. She'd taken the jet places a wounded jet does not go. She had been for 11 minutes the most interesting target in that part of the world, on purpose, with a hole in her airplane and her wingman screaming at her over the radio. "Valkyrie, get out! You're streaming fuel. You're streaming. Get out! Valkyrie." "Not yet," she'd said. Okafor had come in behind her to cover, because that's what a wingman does, and Okafor's jet had taken the hit that had her name on it. He'd ejected. He'd lived. She'd circled the ugly airplane back over his chute, over the cold ground, marking him, calling it in, until the recovery she had bought with her own fuselage came and got him and the downed crew both, all of them, everyone, home. She'd landed with a jet that the maintainers later said should not have made it back. There'd been a fire on the ground crew's side as they safed it. That was the scar. Smooth now, the color of candle wax, on the inside of her right wrist. The recovered crew had started it, VALKYRIE, the one who comes for you. And the ground controllers had picked it up, and by the time the paperwork caught up, it was just her call sign, the way a scar is just your skin. VALKYRIE 1. Okafor had found her afterward, on the ramp, both of them still in their gear, his flight suit torn at the knee from the ejection. He hadn't said, "Thank you. You don't," for that. He'd just put his forehead against her shoulder for a second, the way you lean on a wall when your legs are done, and then he'd straightened up and said, in that everything's fine voice, that his daughter was going to want to meet the lady who flew the broken jet back into the bad place. And Lancaster, who did not cry, had looked at the desert and let her eyes sting and said she'd hold him to it. They'd pinned the pale blue ribbon on her in a quiet room with the shades drawn and told her that most of what she'd done that night was not something she would ever be allowed to talk about. So she didn't. She put the ribbon in a drawer, and she kept flying, and when they sent her to test pilot school, she went, and when they made her a lieutenant colonel, she let them, and when they handed her a sealed tasking that said, "Go to a desert base, fly their check jet, and find out why their readiness numbers are too good to be true," she packed a plain flight suit with no name tape and went. She closed the drawer. She zipped the flight suit to the throat and laid it over the chair for the morning. Out there on the dark ramp, a hydraulic line lay quiet in its repaired clamp, and a fabricated gripe sat photographed on a phone, and a major slept the untroubled sleep of a man who had never once been caught, and a golden boy dreamed of an audience. None of them knew that the woman they'd been calling Clipboard for 3 days had a name the recovery community still said in a particular way, and that she had come for them, the way she came for everyone, quietly, on time, and from a direction they were not watching. Morning. 0700. The cool wouldn't last an hour. Lancaster walked out to the jet in her flight suit and her worn gloves, helmet bag in one hand, and the flight line stopped pretending not to watch. The schedule said the check flight was on. It said a pilot was flying it. It did not, in the version most of them had seen, say who. She did her walk around one more time. Then she went up the ladder. Maddox materialized at the base of it with his lieutenants, and this time a wider crowd. Fuel troops, a couple of maintainers, 2 men with phones already out, because Maddox had let it be known there'd be a show. He stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up at the woman buckling into the cockpit and grinned the biggest grin he had. Okay, this is good, he announced to the ramp. Clipboard's gonna fly the jet. Everybody seeing this? She found a chafed line. Now she figures she's Chuck Yeager. He laughed. Ma'am, I need you to climb down before you hurt yourself. That's a $40 million airplane, not a photo op. Lancaster didn't climb down. Her hands moved through the strap-in. Coke fittings, lap belt. The switch flow, that combat sequence, steady as a metronome. Pruitt came across the ramp fast, and the smoothness was gone now. Sanded off by something that had kept him up. The photographs he didn't know about. The binder he was starting to suspect she'd read. He had decided, somewhere in the night, to end this loudly enough that no report would survive it. Get the civilian out of my jet, Pruitt said. To Maddox, loud for the witnesses, building his own record. Unauthorized civilian in a military aircraft. Captain, remove her. Now. And here was the bright line, in the sun, with phones recording. Maddox went up 2 rungs of the ladder, reached into the cockpit, and put his hands on her. One hand closing on her left arm, the other reaching for the coke, fitting at her shoulder to unstrap her. Physically, in front of everyone, hauling a strapped-in pilot out of a cockpit by force. Lancaster did not fight him. That was the thing nobody could explain afterward. She didn't pull away, didn't shout, didn't pull rank she wasn't wearing. With his hand clamped on her arm, her right hand simply kept moving, completing the lineup check, the last items, calm as still water. And she turned her head and looked at him from a foot away. And she smiled. It was the first time anyone on that base had seen her smile. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who has just watched you sign something you can't take back. You really want your name on that order, Major? She said, not to Maddox, past him, to Pruitt at the bottom of the ladder. Quiet, almost gentle. Both your names, on video, pulling a rated pilot out of a cockpit. The smile didn't move. Go ahead, finish it. Maddox's hand tightened on her arm, and the tower keyed up. The flight line loudspeaker, the big horn mounted on the pole by the fuel pits, the one that pipes ground and tower frequency across the whole ramp so the troops can hear active aircraft calls, crackled to life in the sudden way it does, and a controller's voice, clear and bored and routine, rolled out across the concrete and bounced off the hangar wall and reached every single person standing on that flight line at the same instant. Valkyrie 1, winds calm, runway. 18, cleared for takeoff. The ramp went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has a pressure to it. The 2 men with phones stopped narrating. The fuel troops stopped moving. Somewhere, a generator hummed, and that was the only sound in the world. The tower was working the real schedule. The real schedule had a call sign on it. The call sign was strapped into the jet with a captain's hands on her arm. Ferrante was the first to move. He came off the maintenance wall, like something had pulled him upright by the spine, and he crossed 20 feet of concrete, and he stopped at the base of the ladder, and he came to attention. A 30-year chief, snapping to in front of a clipboard. and he brought his hand up in a salute so crisp it could have cut the air. "That's VALKYRIE 1, he said. His voice cracked and he didn't care. "Air Force Cross, Combat Search and Rescue, 16. You've got your hands on a legend, Captain. Get them off her. Get them off her right now." Maddox didn't move. He couldn't. His brain hadn't caught up to his ears. His face did the whole thing then, in front of everyone, in the time it takes to drop a coin. The grin first, still there out of habit. Then confusion, the eyebrows pulling in. "Valkyrie, what? Who?" Then disbelief, the head giving a tiny shake. No, she's a clipboard. This is a bit. Somebody's messing with the freak. Then recognition, as his eyes went from the woman's face to the burn scar on the wrist of the arm he was holding, to the way her free hand had never once stopped flying the airplane. Recognition arriving like cold water down the back of the neck. And then, last, horror. Pure, total, career-ending horror. The look of a man who has just understood that the worst thing he has ever done, he did on camera, with his hands, to the wrong person, while a loudspeaker told everyone her name. He let go of her arm like it was the hot section of an engine. A staff car had pulled up at the edge of the ramp. A young officer in service dress got out fast, a general's aide with a folder, and walked straight across the flight line and stopped at the foot of the ladder beside Ferrante and saluted upward. "Lieutenant Colonel Lancaster," the aide said, loud and clear, and for the record. "Ma'am, the general sends his respects and asks if you require anything before your flight. We have your orders and the audit authority on file." He turned then and looked at Pruitt, and his voice changed. "Major Pruitt, the general would also like to see you. Immediately." Pruitt had gone the color of the concrete. 2 security forces members were already walking toward him, unhurried, the way you walk toward a man who isn't going to run because his legs have stopped working. Up in the cockpit, Lancaster finished her checks. She keyed the radio, and her voice went out over the same loudspeaker that had just changed every life on that ramp, calm and load-bearing, and exactly as far as it needed to carry. "Tower, VALKYRIE 1, copy cleared for takeoff." Then, off the radio, down to the man frozen on the ladder, in a voice meant only for him. "Hands off the aircraft, Captain. I have the jet." Around him, the ramp was rearranging itself in real time. The lieutenants who'd laughed on cue for 3 days had gone still and small, each one privately running the tape of every joke he'd told, every grin he'd offered up to the front of the room. Pratt, the one who'd looked at Maddox in the ready room like a man led into a wall, had taken his hat off without seeming to know he'd done it. The fuel troop stood at a loose, unconscious attention. Nobody was filming her now. The 2 men with phones had lowered them, because some part of them understood that what was happening was not the kind of thing you point a camera at. It was the kind of thing you stand still for. Maddox came down the ladder backward, one rung at a time, like a man descending from somewhere he should never have climbed. The canopy came down over Lancaster's head, sealing her into the cool quiet of the cockpit, where the only voice was the one she trusted, and the engine spooled up, and the jet rolled forward off the chocks, while behind her, in her mirrors, 2 security forces troops walked Major Dale Pruitt off the flight line, with a hand on each arm, the exact thing he'd ordered done to her, done now to him, in the same sun, in front of the same phones. The check flight took 51 minutes. She wrung the jet out the way it was supposed to be wrung out. The full functional profile, every system. The flight controls Pruitt's people swore were broken, and weren't. The engine they'd certified without ever lighting. She found 2 real discrepancies, neither dangerous, both legitimate, and she logged them honestly, because that was the entire point. An honest check, flown by a real pilot, written down true. When she taxied back in, the flight line was still there. Most of it hadn't moved. What came after came fast. the way these things do once the first signature cracks. The Inspector General's team, already inbound, because Lancaster's tasking had never been only about a jet, opened Pruitt's records that afternoon. The picture Ferrante had assembled alone in the vault was assembled now by people with subpoena power and no reason to protect anyone. Dozens of functional check flights signed and never flown. Flight hours invented. Readiness numbers that were the cleanest in the wing because the dangerous, expensive truth had been replaced with a pen. Jets that young pilots had flown into the sky on the strength of a lie. Maddox's fabricated gripe, the red X with Lancaster's forged signature, the one meant to scrub her flight and bury the binder, turned out to be the most useful thing he ever produced. It was a documented act, time-stamped, witnessed, and it tied him directly to the effort to obstruct the audit. He had spent 3 days building, with his own hands and his own audience, the case against himself. And Lieutenant Sarah Vance walked into the IG's interview room on the second day, on her own, without being summoned, with her hands shaking and her chin up. 2 weeks ago, I wrote up a jet for a flight control fault, she said. It was real. I flew it anyway. Major Pruitt's office told me to fly it or lose my wings, and Captain Maddox laughed about it. And I flew a jet I knew was wrong because I was afraid. I've been afraid the whole time I've been here, she swallowed. I'm not going to be afraid about this part. I'll testify, whatever you need. I should have said it 2 weeks ago. I'm saying it now. It is a hard thing to stand in the truth when you stayed quiet through the easy part. It costs more, late, than it would have cost early. Vance paid it anyway, and that is its own kind of brave, the kind that doesn't get a call sign, but should. If this is the part of the story that got you, the quiet ones, the late but real courage, the truth that just waits until it can speak for itself, then subscribe to Honor Tales before you go. We tell this kind of story every single day, and you belong here for them. Dusk. The desert went the color of the ribbon in her drawer. Lancaster signed the honest check flight report at the operations desk, in ink, her real signature this time, and the date, and her rank. She closed the binder and squared its spine with the others, the way she'd left the first one. She walked the flight line one more time, alone in the cooling air, past the jet that had told the truth that morning. The ramp was empty now. The crowd was gone. The phones were gone. Ferrante was waiting at the end of it, by the fuel pits, where the loudspeaker hung silent on its pole. He came to attention as she reached him, and he saluted, and this time she stopped, and she returned it, slow and exact, holding his eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. 3 days, I called you clipboard in my own head before I figured it out. "You figured it out the first morning, Chief," she said. "You just didn't have a word for it yet. That's not the same as being wrong." A pause. "You photographed that binder when it cost you to. You warned a stranger when it could have ended you. Don't apologize to me. You're the reason this worked." His jaw worked. He nodded. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Not the cheap contractor phone. The other one. The one with no name on it. She stepped a few feet away, into the last of the light, and answered, and listened. A voice came through, older now, steady, a little gravel in it. A voice with a way of saying everything's fine, that made everything feel fine, even across a secure line, even after all these years. "Valkyrie 1, this is Talon." A breath. "They need you in the Pacific. There's a carrier, and there's a problem, and there's exactly one name everybody upstairs keeps saying, and it's yours. I told them I'd ask. I'm asking." Lancaster looked out across the flight line, at the silent loudspeaker, at the jet that had told the truth, at Ferrante standing at the edge of the dark with his hand finally down. She thought about a hole in an airplane and a chute over cold ground, and a debt that had been hers, that night, and was his now, This night, and how the math of that never really closes. It just changes direction. On my way, she said. She closed to the phone. She walked toward the light at the edge of the ramp, where a car was waiting, her worn gloves in one hand, and she did not look back, because she never did. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.